Let's study this week's Parsha, Lech Lecha, with Rashi's commentary. And I'm going to pick up in our story of Abraham and Sarah when Abraham and Lot part ways. Please let there be no strife between me and you, Abraham says to Lot. And Lot raises his eyes and sees the entire plain of the Jordan. And Abraham goes the other direction. He dwelled in the land of Canaan, Avram did, while Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain and pitched tent as far as Sodom. So here we have the very beginning of the inclusion of Sodom and Gemorah. Lot is associated with them. And the Torah goes on to say in verse 13 of chapter 13, Va'anshe Sodom ra'im v'chata'im l'Adonai ma'od. The people of Sodom were both ra'im and chata'im. And Rashi is going to pick up on the use of both of those adjectives coming together. And the Torah could have told us in one word that they were not such wonderful people of character. Could have said ra'im, could have said evil, could have said they were sinners, chata'im. But instead, the Torah describes those people of Sodom as ra'im v'chata'im, evil and sinful. Rashi comes to do short entries in this case. And he says ra'im relates to their bodies, begufam. Whether that was sexual impropriety or they didn't treat their bodies as holy vessels. One could ask, what does it mean to be wicked, either through one's body or with one's body? And in that case, ra'im, evil doing, is limited by Rashi to the body in some way, shape, or form. But we are left with the question, what exactly does that mean? Same goes for chata'im in this case. They were sinful. B'mamonam. They were sinful with their money. They were sinful with their property. How many different ways do we know about people being sinful with their money? Whether it's stealing a little for themselves, defrauding people, large scale, small scale. These are the kinds of descriptors that set the stage for what will happen later on in Parshat Vayera. We read the story of God wanting to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah and Abraham's standing up for potentially the few righteous souls that live in those cities. But we don't often think of the broader context of having encountered the first words about the people of Sodom in chapter 13 of Parshat Lech Lecha. And there's more to the story as well in terms of context. We know Lot was kidnapped from there and was not yet seen as the family member who needed to be rescued from a den of immorality, like we will read again in Parshat Vayera. In this week's Parshat Lech Lecha, Lot is kidnapped. Avram is called upon by the local kings of those cities of the plains to go and put an end to Chedorlaomer's militant, imperial driving into the plains of Canaan. Remember that he's coming from Elam, which is all the way over in the Mesopotamian region. So the next time we meet anyone from Sodom, we don't meet the people of Sodom. We meet the king of Sodom. And in fact, we meet the king of Sodom and Amorah, Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, Avram has to fight back the enemies on those local Canaanite kings' behalves, along with some partners. we can imagine, from those different mini city-states, mini kingdoms. And after they make war, the Elamites wind up driving those Canaanite kings into hiding. And it's then we learn that God performed a miracle for the king of Sodom. Because they, the king of Sodom and Gemorah, Sodom and Gomorrah, jumped into bitumen wells, according to the text in chapter 14, verse 10. And God, within those pits of the earth, within those wells, creates a flooring of sorts from the clay that exists there. And instead of sinking into the pits, these kings of Sodom and Gomorrah are able to hide out and then arise. Na'asa nes, and God created a miracle, LaMelech Sodom, for the king of Sodom, sheyatza misham, that he could emerge from there after the fighting was done. Lefi shayu b'umot mikitzatan shelo hayu ma'aminin, because several of the people amongst the Canaanite nations, obviously including the king of Sodom, didn't believe in the God of Israel, didn't believe in the God of Abraham, and would not turn towards the God that Abraham believed in. But the kevan sheyatzazeh min hachemar, because the king of Sodom emerged from that pit, was saved from being swallowed up by that well, burned up, drowned. He'eminu va'avram l'mafreya. They retrospectively believed in Abraham and all that took place for him, all that befell him. Now, that could be a reference simply to a moment of salvation for Abraham, some heroic tale, hagiographic kind of tale, talking about the wonder of this Abraham to whom God turned. Or it could have been regarding the salvation that Abraham experienced in winning the battle against the very powerful forces of Shedalomer and the Elamites. Whichever way it works out, more context is presented to us for the Sodom and Gomorrah story. And Abraham sticking up for them and arguing with God when God's ready to destroy them for their immorality. Now, we learned in chapter 13 that they were ra'im v'chata'im. They were evildoers with their bodies. They were sinners with their money. But here, Abraham made a new friend in chapter 14. He had an alliance of sorts. Yes, it was to save Lot, his nephew, who lived with the Sodomites at that time. But here the king of Sodom is said by Rashi to have believed now, at least in Abraham, if not the God of Abraham. And that changes everything when we think about Abraham's argument with God concerning righteous souls in the city of Sodom. Now, Abraham didn't say, well, won't you save the city of Sodom for the righteous king with whom I have an alliance? He left it to God to judge all the way in terms of the king of Sodom's righteousness before God. But he did challenge God to ask whether or not this friend, this ally, with whom he had fought previously, deserves the kind of forceful destruction that will be rained upon the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And with a little bit more understanding of how Rashi presents the Sodomites in chapter 13, the king of Sodom in chapter 14, we then can appreciate in a deeper way all that will be brought forward in chapter 18 when it comes to Abraham and God arguing about the fate or the destiny of Sodom and Gomorrah. Shabbat Shalom.